started as an intern and ended as a curator of birds. Zoos typically deal with the fact that their buildings cause mortality of wild birds, especially through their glass exhibits, and windows and handrails bring bird collision problems interior to the building. In 2007, Dr. Sheppard joined the board of the Bird Safe Glass Foundation as a science advisor. She has conducted basic research into the effectiveness of different patterns in preventing bird collisions, and in 2019, she moved to the American Bird Conservancy.
2009.
Oh, 2009. Sorry about that. She led the team that developed USGBC Lead Pilot Credit 55, reducing bird mortality.
Okay.
Yep.
All right, so I am from American Bird Conservancy. We used to be small, now we're getting to be a medium-sized nonprofit works exclusively with bird conservation in the Western Hemisphere. And we do everything from create reserves for the last remaining pairs of a special hummingbird to the sorts of things I do which go beyond the Western Hemisphere, since a lot of threats to birds are really global. These are mandated slides if you're taking this. One of the species that we've created a reserve for in Peru is this one, the marvelous spatule-tailed hummingbird. And it's a perfect example of why many people believe that birds simply have intrinsic value. Birds have cultural value. If you go around the world, you find that actually similar species represent many of humanity's best attributes, things like liberty, peace, fidelity, and happiness. But birds also provide a lot of eco-services, more than most people really are aware of. And just to name a couple, birds are seed dispersers. They're very important in habitat regeneration. Going back to hummingbirds, hummers often drop seeds over areas that have burned, so they start some of this regeneration of habitat. Birds consume enormous numbers of insect pests. They contribute an immense amount to agriculture. They eat insects that might otherwise give you West Nile virus or something worse, and they eat bugs that will consume your crops or destroy your forests. So birds do a lot of good that we're not often aware of. And then bird watching, this is an old slide, is actually a $50 billion industry at this point. And that includes everything from the trendy bird watching gear these guys are wearing to their giant telescopes and bed and breakfast and so forth. So there are a lot of jobs that depend on birds too. Unfortunately, my videos don't work on this version of the meeting software, so you're not going to get to see this little bird who was rehabilitated after hitting a window, be released and immediately fly off and smack into a piece of mirrored glass. It's the only video I know of a bird actually hitting glass because it's very hard to predict exactly where that's going to happen. But if we look at some numbers, you can see we used to think that collisions with buildings was the biggest man-made threat. And in fact, now that we're getting more data that shows that most monitoring programs are missing as many as 80% of the birds that die, this number, 300 million to a billion, may actually increase. At the moment, cats actually seem to win the prize. So if you have a cat, keep it indoors. It's better for it. It's better for the environment. It's better for you. Frequently when I come to do a class, people are really worried, that I'm going to say, well, you have to build concrete bunkers. You can't use glass. So here, this is the new Intuit headquarters. It just opened in Mountain View. This is a community in California that requires bird-friendly design. And it shows that you can make a sort of boring glass box if you want to. Doing bird-friendly design does not need to inhibit a style of architecture or the creativity of architects, and we'll come back to that again later. So to sort of give you some brief background, the majority of birds that are killed by collisions are migrants. These are songbirds in general that are going between breeding grounds in North America to wintering habitats further south. So they fly at night, partly so they're not fried by the sun, but also because they have to feed during the day. When they come down, they have to restore the fat reserves that they were using to fly hundreds and sometimes thousands of miles at a time. So they're in an unfamiliar place, and this is when collisions are most frequent. There are also peaks of collisions when local birds are fledging young, and there are peaks of collisions in the winter as birds that are resident leave their territories and start flying around in flocks, especially around bird feeders. One of the things that I always forget to mention is that migration is happening at night. The collisions are happening during the day. So the majority of collisions happen after sunrise, and they continue to occur all through the day as birds are flying around looking for food. So if there's a billion dead birds out there, why aren't we seeing them? Well, scavengers take birds very quickly. There have been a lot of studies now on the rate of scavenging, and in some cases, scavengers actually stake out really good windows where lots of collisions occur. Birds may flutter off and die. Lots of people say, oh, it hit the window, but it flew away. Studies that have taken these birds and followed their fate show that most of them have internal hemorrhages, concussions, and this can make them more vulnerable to predation, or they simply die from their injuries several days later. And they can also hit a window and bounce away so that they land in shrubbery and other plantings so that you just don't see them. This is the same reason that we don't see dead pigeons all over the place. So I'm going to spend a tiny bit of time talking about how birds see the world, because it's very different from the way people see the world. And I've been working on trying to figure out how to look at the world like a bird for quite a few years now. Humans and other primates have sort of flat faces. They've got eyes that are close together in the front of their faces. There's a lot of overlap between the left eye and the right eye fields. This gives us great depth perception. It gives us 3D vision. We're not so good at seeing what's going on behind us. Birds, on the other hand, in general, and certainly the birds we're talking about, have eyes on the sides of their heads. So there's very little overlap between those visual fields. You can see with my sophisticated diagram here. They don't see the same thing out of each eye. What they see out of their eyes are quite different. And they don't have very good depth perception. They have other mechanisms that tell them how fast they're flying and how long it's going to take for them to get where they're going. Birds can see more colors than we can. This is not because birds are exceptional. It's because mammals actually lost some of their color vision ability back when mammals were sort of scurrying around in the dark. So birds can see actually not just more colors, they can see farther out into the blue, sometimes even into the ultraviolet. Not all birds see ultraviolet, and the distribution of UV vision among taxa has actually just been found to be a lot more complicated than we thought. Birds can perceive the Earth's magnetic field and use it for navigation. And the one area where humans actually do better than birds is this, contrast sensitivity. This is the ability to distinguish between two things at a distance. And our contrast sensitivity gets worse as we get older, which is one reason that we tend to need reading glasses. From the same distance away, it's harder for birds to distinguish amongst multiple objects. And as we'll find out, this actually makes it harder to make a pattern, a solution that will stop bird collisions and yet not be visible to people. If it's not visible to people, most of the time, it's not actually visible to the birds either. So my current model for a bird in flight is a kid texting on a skateboard, and I've never been fast enough to actually get a video of that. This is the closest I've gotten, is a guy texting on a hoverboard. Birds aren't focused in front of themselves the way we are. We see the world as something we're walking into. Birds are immersed in the world, and they're often much more interested in whether there's a predator, where food is. What's in front of them is not necessarily where they're focused. And for this reason, we have to grab their attention if we want them to not fly into glass as an obstacle. So, unfortunately for you, you don't get to see my YouTube video where this guy cleans a glass wall and a whole bunch of people smash into it. People run into glass all the time and are often actually quite severely injured. And if you go on the internet, you'll find lots of videos of this and even compilations. But people learn cues that tell them where glass is. So if you put up a row of decals like this, people know, I have a concept of glass, it's a transparent barrier. Those decals mean that glass is there. Birds never understand those cues. They don't understand the concept of glass as a transparent barrier. And unfortunately, this is another thing that doesn't work. But if I take away the cues that tell you that glass is there, if you look at this picture only, you can't tell me if this is trees seen through glass, if it's a reflection of trees in glass, or if I simply went out and took a picture of a tree. Now, when you see this picture, there's a crack here, there are mullions, you know that glass is involved somehow, but we have to look at this before you understand that it's a mirrored glass building. Birds don't understand any of the cues that tell you that. They take what they see quite literally. So to them, reflections are as real as the habitat that surrounds them. This, by the way, is transparent glass. It's not even mirrored glass. Birds often try to fly to things they see on the other side of glass. In this case, this is the Ford Foundation atrium in Manhattan on 42nd Street, and there are many more trees in this atrium than there are on the street for several blocks in either direction. So if you're a bird that's come down after migrating for several hundred miles, and the sun comes up and you're looking around for greenery because that's where you're going to find food, you're very apt to try to fly right into that atrium and hit that glass. The same piece of glass can look very different at different times. So the same glass on different facades of a single building can look very different at different times. And this is something that's very important to realize, because a lot of times you'll just go and take a look at one piece of glass and think you know what's going on, when in fact it may be much more complicated. So we have a lot more detailed scientific information on bird mortality from things like cell towers and wind turbines than we do with birds on glass. Part of that is because glass is pervasive throughout the environment, whereas it's easy to know exactly where all the turbines or all the cell towers are. The other reason is that the people who first started documenting bird collisions weren't scientists. They were bird lovers who wanted to try to rescue the birds that weren't dead yet. They wanted to document this problem and get somebody to do something about it. So we have an abundance of monitoring data, but it's relatively anecdotal. In many cases, people couldn't write down if they went out on a day and didn't find any collisions, and so forth. So it's been a bit of a challenge to try to data mine and come up with information, but people are starting to do that quite seriously now. We do know that the more glass on the facade, the more collisions you get. This is from a study that was done in Manhattan, and that applies to the relative amount of glass as well as to the absolute amount of glass, although we don't know as much about the distribution of glass as I would like to know. When I first started, people kept repeating that it was ironic that green design required these giant curtain wall buildings. And in fact, it turns out that this is not true. And every couple of years you'll see an editorial in Architecture Magazine or something like that about how these buildings actually are not as energy efficient as they could be. That once you get above 40 to 50% on the glass facade, you're starting to increase your HVAC costs. So even if you're LEED Platinum, you could have had a more sustainable building had you not used all that glass. I'm not going to talk very much about light, and you're not going to see this video, but bright lights surrounded by darkness seem to trap birds. This is the 9/11 memorial in New York City, and when this is going, volunteers from the New York City Audubon Society stay up all night, and when this many birds collect in the beams, they turn them off. The birds are released, they turn them back on. Migration is very variable, weather dependent. Some years they don't have to do it at all. Sometimes they have to turn the lights off 10 times. You see the same phenomenon at isolated drilling rigs in the oceans, for example. But we used to see big bird kill events back, say in the 40s, when cities were largely dark and had a single Washington Monument or Empire State Building, Statue of Liberty. Now, there's so much light pollution that you're not getting that same impact of birds all being found in one particular area. We know that lights impact and disorient birds, and that there is a correlation between the amount of light emitted by a building, not its height, but the amount of light emitted by a building and the number of collisions. But exactly how that works seems to be much more complicated than people thought, and it's going to take a lot more than simply turning off the top lights of the 10 tallest buildings to actually make an impact on bird collisions. People often think because of the migration tie-in that north and south facades of buildings are going to kill more birds. That's not true. As I said earlier, birds land after they migrate, and then they're flying around in all directions looking for greenery. So there's a definite correlation between glass that reflects vegetation and bird kill. And this is very much like, you've heard the old adage that most most car accidents happen within 20 miles of home. That's because that's where most of the driving happens. So birds tend to be most active around vegetation because that's where they find food and shelter and so forth. And when the glass reflects that, it appears to be an extension of that habitat. This doesn't mean that there are no collisions higher up on buildings, but if you're prioritizing, it's those windows that reflect greenery that are the ones to work on first. Sometimes birds see through multiple panes of glass to something they want to go to on the other side. Birds often follow the same kinds of pathways that people do, and pathways for people often end at glass doors. This happens to be a path at the San Diego Zoo, which ends in a glass window. And you can think of a number of ways that you might make that much safer for birds. But, given the chance, like people, birds aren't going to fly through a dense habitat if they can just fly down a path. Green roofs are turning out to be a real boon to birds in many ways. There are enough of them out there now that have been around long enough that it's been demonstrated that they can, provide a food resource for birds. It can provide them resting habitat and so forth. It can also bring them close to glass they might not otherwise go near. So this is something to remember when you're designing a building. The green roof can be an issue for glass that's adjacent to it, but it's easy to fix. Birds often fly into courtyards and atria. This is one in Southern California. There's water here, there are plants. So birds that are flying by above may come straight down into this courtyard to take advantage of those resources. Unfortunately, and this happens, there's a New York Times building in New York City has an internal atrium where birds actually come down many stories to get to the trees. Birds don't then fly back up the way they glue in. They have a tendency to try to fly out towards the habitat reflected in the glass on the lower floors. So this is something to be aware of, when you're designing a building. It's easy to funnel birds into a dangerous spot. I've seen lots and lots of buildings where you've got two wings connected by glass skywalks, and those are very commonly high areas of collision incidents, especially if there's a lot of vegetation between the two building rings. The birds come in there, and then they just keep, moving along until they smash into those building connectors. People are putting more and more glass structures into the environment, and ground-level structures can kill birds as well as curtain walls. I've been contacted by people in about 10 states now because bus shelters are commonly causes of bird collisions. So as I said earlier, birds aren't expecting a barrier ahead of themselves. They're often, they fly towards sort of featureless expanses of cloud or blue sky, something like that. So, it takes a tree for them to say, something I have to avoid. This is a kind of signal that you actually, have to try to come up with for a bird. In a sense, it's biomimicry. You have to make your glass look like habitat that birds can't or don't want to penetrate. Excuse me. If you watch birds, you'll notice that they fly into trees all the time. They fly through branches. They fly through small spaces. It turns out that birds are very aware of their body sizes. They nest and roost in cavities like this. They know how big they are. And this is why even small pieces of glass can be dangerous for birds. Based on research done by people like Dan Clem and Martin Rusler and stuff I've done, we talk about the 2x4 rule. Vertical stripes, vertical lines that are 4 inches apart, most birds won't try to fly through. It doesn't work for hummers. Horizontal lines have to be closer together, and you can see why. The lines have to be wide enough to be visible. It doesn't have to be lines. It can be dots. It can be squiggles. I can't tell you about diagonal lines because I haven't had time to actually ask birds that question. But the patterns that you have to create to attract birds' attention, for them to decide to avoid a surface, there's a lot of relationship to the size of the small birds that are the most frequent collision victims. Now, this is the exception that proves the rule. You almost never see swallows on lists of birds that have hit glass. And they're incredible aerial acrobats. This bird has flipped sideways to go between two barn doors that are less than an inch apart. And I think another factor involved probably has to do not just with reaction time, but I sort of imagine that a swallow approaching a glass wall might actually feel wind blowing back from the surface. And they have a very quick reaction time they can pull out before they hit it. Something like a thrush flies more like an express train. And they don't have the time they need to change direction. This is something they're finding out with research that relates to birds hitting aircraft. They can see exactly at what point birds are noticing an aircraft approach. The birds don't have enough time to actually physically move out of the way once they know that something's coming. They don't have enough distance. And birds have not unfrequently been reported slamming into things like whitewashed walls. It's not an everyday occurrence, but birds that are very distracted, birds that have been disturbed off a roost or something, are often flying paying attention to what's behind them. In a case like that, no strong signal, they actually can fly into a blank wall. So this is the setup that I've been using to look at birds in glass. It's based on a design created by Martin Rusler, who works in Austria. For some reason, in the 90s, early 2000s, a lot of transparent highway noise barriers were erected in European countries, and there's now a literature in everything from Croatian to Italian on this problem. In Austria, they decided to hire someone to try to solve it, and he created this testing apparatus that we have here. This is at a bird banding station called Powder Mill outside of Pittsburgh. It belongs to the Carnegie Museum. It's at their Avian Research Center. And this is what a bird sees. They've been netting and studying birds there for over 50 years. And as birds come out of the nets and are weighed and measured and sexed and aged, some of them come out and are placed in the tunnel. It's dark, and they see what appears to be two possible exit routes down at this bright other end. Now, if you look at this picture, you can see that there's a net that covers the end of this tunnel, so birds don't actually hit glass. When we use no glass, or when we use two plain glass controls, 50% of the birds fly to the left, 50% of the birds fly to the right. So the score is the number of birds, the percent of birds that fly to the control. 50% means no effect of whatever it is you're testing. And the more birds, when we put something we're testing on one side, the more birds fly to the control, the more we believe that birds are actually avoiding the thing that we're testing. And I don't have time today, that was interesting, to go through any of this data, but I'm happy to talk to anybody about it if you're interested. This type of data was the basis for the LEED credit. When I first started, there had been a couple of attempts to develop a LEED credit largely based on landscaping, and it kept collapsing because the architects would say, well, how near is far? How big is large? And it was obvious that there was a need for quantification. So we were able to use tunnel scores to develop an index, and we'll get to that briefly again in a minute. Here's a quick case study at the University of Minnesota. They installed glass railings after a renovation, and almost instantly they were getting huge numbers of collisions. At one point, 30 birds in an hour. So their ops people ran out with painter's tape and did this, which bought them some time. At that point, which was 4 or 5 years ago, they decided to go with medium range solution bird tape. This is a translucent tape. As they were putting up the templates, took down the painter's tape, they started getting collisions again. So this is what it looks like now. This stuff has actually held up through Minnesota's winters and summers, which is pretty amazing, but they haven't had any collisions. And they're still trying to decide whether they're going to spend some money and use wire railings or etch it or grow vines over it or something like that. Typically what happens is you put up something like this, and after a couple of days everybody forgets it's there. So it doesn't become, sort of the top of the list for the budget priorities. So we talked about patterns. To be effective, a pattern not only has to have a design that birds perceive as something they can't fly through, the pattern itself actually has to be visible. And reflections on the outside surface of glass can make patterns that you put on the inside less visible or invisible. Contrast with what's reflected, whatever the glass looks like, can change how effective a pattern is. So here on the left, you can see how effective just a standard ordinary window screen is. This is a great solution. It's not useful if you've got a curtain wall, but if you've got a small building, if you have openable windows, this is a really good solution if your screens are on the outside. Here, you can see black stripes have been applied to the outside surface and the inside surface. So outside, inside. You can't see those black stripes from the inside very well. Black doesn't reflect light. Over here, a few minutes later, same window, the stripes on the inside are much more visible. The stripes on the outside are the most visible. If this window were reflecting a big white cloud, the black on the outside might work better. Black on the inside probably wouldn't. So this is something to keep in mind. Traditionally in the U.S., it's been difficult to get glass that has a pattern on surface one, the outside surface. But that is becoming much more possible. There's new technology that actually makes it easier to get glass produced more locally with a side one pattern. There are a number of European companies where, sorry, Amber Alert on my phone. They have been using surface one patterns much more frequently for a long time. So it is possible, and more architects are starting to incorporate side one patterns into their designs, especially in areas where bird-friendly design is required. Internal blinds can work, internal shades less so, if they're visible. So here you can see internal white shades. White shades were a common recommendation long ago, and you get quite strong reflections on them. Same thing if you've got blinds that are closed. If you can see partially open blinds, though, you see they create this pattern that competes with the reflection. So my usual recommendation to somebody who wants to know if they can do something on the inside of their window is, stick a Post-it note on it and then go outside every hour or so from sunup to sundown and see if you can see it. If you can, then you probably can do something on the inside. And you could even put a pattern on the inside of these shades. And this is an attempt to sum it up by somebody who doesn't know how to actually do Photoshop and things like that. As you go from left to right, the lines get wider. So you can see that these very skinny lines are essentially invisible against the reflection on this window. As they get wider, they're more visible. As you go from this one to this one to this one to this one, they're also getting denser or more opaque. So here, you can actually see those narrow lines against the black sky. They're not very visible against the vegetation. And if you go over here, obviously the widest, densest lines are the ones that are most visible against all of the different types of background that are shown in this reflection. So that may sound simplistic, but there's a tendency to want to minimize whatever you're using to deter collisions. And you just have to remember not to do that to the point where the birds can't see it. So this slide actually needs to be updated, but starting in 2009, when San Francisco passed standards for bird-safe buildings and the lead credit for reducing bird collisions came out, a lot of different jurisdictions have passed ordinances, codes, voluntary guidelines, and so forth, and there are others in progress. And that ranges from Highland Park, Illinois, which is a relatively small community, to the state of Minnesota, which requires bird-friendly design for any structure that gets any state funding. And if you're a Vikings fan, you may have noticed that there was a lot of conflict there over a stadium that got approval just before this mandate went into effect. There are really two basic models that you'll find out there. The lead pilot credit basically requires that you get an assigned value, there's a table, for all of the different materials on your facade. The ones in the lower levels cost you twice because of that reflective vegetation issue. And you use it to create an index very much the way you would create an index to look at thermal regulation in a building. And to get the lead credit, you have to have an index of 15 or less. The credit allows you the flexibility to have some amount of mirrored glass if you want it. You can have lots and lots of glass if it's very bird-friendly glass, and anywhere in between. So the goal there was to allow flexibility so that architects in particular didn't feel that, that they were very constrained, that there were only sort of two ways you could do a bird-friendly building. The San Francisco building standard has been used as a model, especially in other communities in California, and they basically use the requirement of glass that meets that 2x4 rule we talked about in some way or other. In San Francisco, it's restricted to facades that are within 300 feet of a 2-acre water or vegetation feature. Oakland then passed the same thing, except they made it a 1-acre park, and by the time you get down to Mountain View, that requirement is for all the size of a building. So there's a lot of variability here. And there are a number of other communities where they have systems that require you to take a number of sustainability issues into account, to say like what you're doing about it or why you can't do something about it. And I haven't figured out quite how to track all of those. But Washington, D.C. is one where you have to get a certain number of points, and you can pick from a menu, and bird collisions are about to go on that. So this is another case study. This is the first building that I was seriously involved in monitoring because it's on the Bronx Zoo grounds, and I was there when we designed it. And we designed it to incorporate all of the sort of the best practices at the time. New York City Audubon had just come out with a document listing best practices, and the wife of Bruce Fowle, the architect, was the head of New York City Audubon, and everybody was in the Bird Safe Glass Foundation. So the desire was to make this building bird-friendly. They got an innovation point for making 50% of the glass bird-friendly. The building opened in 2009. It was just as I was leaving, but I continued to do the monitoring, and I actually still have a cubicle back in here. So here you can see there's a green roof. They've got a nice wire railing. They put louvers on the adjacent glass. There are still collisions on these louvers. I think they were intended originally to have a narrower spacing, but a lot of value engineering went on. We get fewer collisions on this glass than we would expect to if the louvers weren't there. One of the things that I found out as I was monitoring this building is that nobody had actually ever tested any of the recommendations that were accepted best practice back in 2009. So that was very eye-opening for me as I was trying to figure out was there science behind these recommendations. This is the only part of the building that actually hasn't been associated with a bird kill. It's a corner conference room, and it has an early version of this German glass Ornolux. This particular type is no longer manufactured, but you can see that it's quite visible to humans. Presumably to many birds it's actually more visible. The majority of the glass in this building design has light-colored shades. That was a very standard recommendation, I assume, based on the fact that if you make a mirror, you put a black background on a reflective surface, and you can see you get very strong reflections here. You don't have to be at this angle. You can be out here. It's just hard to get there. You can see the reflections on the glass and on the shades are both probably pretty dangerous. This glass has been a huge bird hazard, and at this point it's been remediated. So it's not a problem anymore. But early on, it was a very good demonstration of why this recommendation has to be taken with a grain of salt. This is a good example of channeling. Out here is a field which takes the water that comes off the building. There's actually a a small lake behind this building. Birds come out here, hit the rocky outcrop, and go straight into the front doors. You can see there's a pretty strong reflection there. This had the highest rate of collisions per square foot for any other section of this building. Overhangs were another common recommendation. You can imagine this is a reflection. It's not a see-through. So this, if you're a bird sitting in a tree here, the overhang isn't going to stop you from trying to fly to the reflected trees. Not something I recommend unless you go out there with a model and make sure that it actually will do what you want it to do. So, what is a bird-friendly building? It's pretty obvious that this is not a bird-friendly building. You can't tell the real trees from the reflections. This is what I think most architects think when I come in to do a lunch and learn, or a Butler building, or something like that. But in fact, you can make a shiny glass bird-friendly building if you want to. We came across this building, which is an added wing, I think, to the Anchorage Museum by David Chipperfield, who was supposed to do a new wing on the Metropolitan Museum in New York City, and the net is the worst bird killer that's being monitored at this point. So we were very interested when we looked at this because it looks like it meets the guidelines, but it also looks like it could be a bird killer. And I was able to have a conversation with their operations manager, who said, well, he hadn't really thought about it, but he got a lot of collisions on his windows at home, but he did not get reports that, they were having collisions on this building. And it's a natural history wing. I mean, you would definitely expect, even though it's not formally monitored, that they would know if they were getting a lot of collisions on this building. So that was good news for me, anyway. So this is the slide that's supposed to wake you up if you've gone to sleep. The most important thing to remember if you want to design a bird-friendly building is to think about it from the very beginning. I get a lot of calls from people who say, well, we designed this building and I've been assigned to make it bird-friendly. And that is the equivalent of a retrofit. You're talking about changing plans, you're talking about changing materials. It's much more difficult to do than if you think about it when you start. And there seem to be three basic ways of doing this. You can reduce the exposure of glass using things like grills and shades. You can incorporate signals on glass, the kinds of patterns I've been talking about, and you can just generally use less glass. There are plenty of pieces of many buildings, like building connectors, conference rooms that always have their shades drawn, that don't necessarily need plate glass windows. And luckily, bird-friendly design overlaps with a lot of other building elements. So I'm going to show you some quick examples. Here are buildings that have actually gotten the LEED credit. There are 26 of them. It turns out to be very difficult to identify what buildings have gotten the LEED credit unless you've been involved with the design process. You can't look that up in the LEED database that way, and there's a lot of confidentiality, so you have to run around asking people. So if anybody knows of buildings or other projects that have gotten the LEED pilot credit please let me know. You can reduce the exposure of glass. So I'm a big fan of motorized external solar shades. I have some on some of my windows at home. Louvers are great. Grills, external screens, which can also help with control of temperature and light. I think that this building not only is using this as a sunshade, but it's actually probably security because this is an FBI building. This is a nice private home. They've got some nice picture windows on the ends that have motorized shades on them. So when they're not looking out, they can cover up the glass. You can use bird-friendly glass, and more people are doing this on purpose. This Brooklyn Botanical Garden Visitor Center was designed with a custom fit. You can use materials like channel glass, and there are a lot of different versions of channel glass. They don't have to be necessarily this opaque. These are examples of Surface 1 patterns on buildings in Europe, glass block. This is a heavily fitted building in Manhattan. There are things like simple shutters that can be used if people are motivated. Sometimes you want to build a building so that it's just automatically bird friendly. Sometimes you actually can take advantage of things like the fact that most balusters have to be about 4 inches apart because you don't want babies sticking their heads through. So there's a lot of glass that's behind structures like this that is essentially bird friendly before you even start thinking about it. I'm sorry, I took out some of these slides and they seem to have some of them gotten back in. You could design with less glass. This is the Bronx Emergency Call Center that was designed after 9/11. It's just recently opened. There are more windows on one of its sides. If you get close enough to it, it's actually quite an elegant design. Mission to the UN, there's a lot of glass up here, but other than that, down below, it's only the vestibule. It's got a big glass door. You can use brutalist architecture, like this building where I spent a lot of my life, different kinds of materials, or again, you just don't have a lot of exposed glass. People ask about ultraviolet patterns a lot, so I'll mention it briefly, but we're about to run out of time. Birds don't avoid spider webs because spider webs aren't really UV reflective. This is what the current Ornolux pattern looks like, and we're starting to see this in buildings that have been up for now a couple of years. They actually work better than I anticipate based on their tunnel scores, and part of this is that if you have a sample of this stuff and you wiggle it around, from some angles you can see the pattern. And I'm thinking that in the early morning when there really isn't any UV, birds may be able to see this glass the same way we can. So there are a number of places that have not seen collisions. Although, based on the scores for this glass, you might expect that it would reduce collisions, different versions, somewhere between, say, 50 and 70%. Yeah, see, I'm sorry, I got rid of all this stuff, and I opened the wrong presentation. This is a retrofit. If you're trying to retrofit a building, Google actually has a whole wall of these things. It's basically parachute cord installed every 4 inches. You can do a lot with decals and tape. This is bus wrap. This is the National Conservation Training Center. They put a lot of this up. This is what it looks like from the inside. The plain glass you can still see out. And resources. This publication is available as both a PDF. You can download it. It's also available in hard copy. If you're interested in collisions at home, we have a flyer about home collisions. We have a site, birdsmartglass.org, that shows a lot of different solutions and how to get it. I am always available if you're interested in bird-friendly design. I'd be very happy to speak with you and to give you any help I can in designing a building that's safe for birds. Questions?
Let me look at what we had. I know I saw some questions. Let's see. Oh, so one question for me from Matt Valentine had to do with design for birds being addressed in the newly revised high-performance sustainable building requirements. We did not have this covered as it was not in the guiding principles, but I think adding in some information that I could obtain from you, Dr. Sheppard, we could provide some guidance as far as how that should be accomplished.
I'd be happy to help.
Yeah.
I also, there's another site, collisions.abcbirds.org, because the main ABC site is mostly for bird watchers. And there's a fairly extensive annotated bibliography there, and case studies not enough. I'm going to be posting some more fairly soon, so there are other resources in other places.
Let's see. Other questions. We will get, once you have a chance to double check your presentation for whatever the final slides are, will you be able to make those available so we can share those? And then
yes,
people will be able
absolutely.
to get the links? Okay, great.
I can just Dropbox it to you. And we have been working with the GSA.
Okay.
There's been a bill in Congress, and as you know, in the last few years, this kind of bill has not been going very far. But we started talking directly to the GSA, and their initial response was, like, this is a no-brainer. Of course, sustainable buildings shouldn't kill birds. They have actually incorporated a little bit about birds in their internal standards, and I'm hoping to work with them to increase that.
Okay.
But I was able to show them a number of bird-friendly buildings that they'd already built,
okay.
completely by accident.
Oh, great. Yeah, I think it would help to get with you on some good examples that would have crossover with a lot of our types of designs that we're doing with we have a standard design process for a lot of the Army facilities, so that would be good to talk with you about that more.
I'd be really happy to do that, yeah.
Okay.
But,
another question was, is siding of the building enough to help with bird-friendly designs? For example, a lot of our designers are working on less densely populated areas than what you see in a city when they're working on Army installations. Wouldn't the fact that there's an object with not many windows, such as our buildings, be enough to deter birds?
well, if you've got a facility with not many windows, you're ahead of the game right there. There's no guarantee that your location isn't going to have large numbers of birds coming through during migration. And that, is when a lot of collisions happen. So there's a paper done by the Smithsonian, the one that came up with that 330 million to a billion number. Less than half collisions take place on private homes, but that's still a pretty humongous number. The buildings that cause the most collisions are really low-rise suburban buildings, largely because there aren't as many skyscrapers. So it's going to depend on where you are. If you're outside the city and you're in an area with resources that birds are attracted to, you could have significant collisions. Like if you're on the shores of Lake Erie, for example, you're going to have a huge number of birds flying right over you.
Another question, and you might have run into this in your work with GSA. Are you aware of any blast-resistant windows or hurricane glass that are available with good patterns for bird-safe design?
That's something that we've really just started to work on.
Okay.
I was talking to a guy at Eastman, and they have sort of a blast-resistant external film that he thinks they could put patterns on. And we also talked to Solix about trying to do that. So that's definitely a potential. And obviously if the federal government orders some, it would make a huge difference. So I encourage you to think about that.
Okay.
the patterns themselves can be applied to any kind of glass. So you can use etching or you can use spritting. I mean, there's lots and lots of different ways to put a pattern on a type of glass. Ordinarily, you can pretty much get anything you want with a bird-friendly pattern on it.
Okay. I guess another question I would have is with the lead pilot credit. Are there some good, I guess, pointers on, like, embedded in the credit documentation there as far as kind of leading you in the right direction if you do have glass that you're trying to mitigate that on? I saw how you were talking about the two different zones, but do they get into more details, or is that something that
it does get into some detail, but what generally happens is that you ask a question and you get referred to me, so you might as well start talking to me.
Okay.
I've got a number of things that I need to add to the table, but especially for remediation. I mean, if you do a large-scale renovation, you can get the LEED credit for it. But if you're simply trying to mitigate existing windows for bird collisions, there are a number of solutions out there, but that's not really something you'll find in the LEED credit.
Okay. I don't think I see any other questions, and we're right at 3 o'clock, so I think I'll stop the recording.
Okay.